In 1966, America's railroads were collapsing, written off as relics in the jet age. Airlines soared, highways spread, and experts said it would take billions to make trains matter again. But one renegade engineer had a different plan. For the price of a used car, he bolted jet engines, fresh off a nuclear bomber, onto a plain commuter train. In a single day, that plywood and hope experiment smashed a world speed record that still stands. Why did the country bury the train that proved speed did not need big money, just guts? The story starts with the day American rail was declared dead. In the mid-1960s, American railroads were in free fall. The numbers told the story. Passenger miles, once measured in billions, had collapsed to a fraction of their post-war peak. Families who used to ride the 20th Century Limited now packed into station wagons or lined up at airport gates. The jet age wasn't just a buzzword, it was a fact. In 1950, US railroads carried over 37 billion passenger miles. By 1966, that had dropped below 10 billion. Every year, more trains vanished from the timetable, replaced by shiny new highways and crowded runways. The world was watching Japan. In 1964, the Shinkansen bullet train slashed the trip from Tokyo to Osaka in half, hitting speeds over 125 miles per hour. It ran on tracks built from scratch, welded smooth and guarded by fences. The American response was envy and denial. Railroad executives argued that US tracks, built for steam engines and patched together with iron bolts, could never handle those speeds. Consultants warned Congress that matching the Japanese would cost billions, maybe more. The message was clear: high-speed trains belonged overseas. Here at home, the future belonged to jets and Chevrolets. But behind the scenes, the New York Central was bleeding money. Every empty seat was another nail in the coffin. The company faced a brutal choice: invest in a miracle or fade into history. The experts had their answer. Start over, tear up the rails, spend a fortune. But desperation has a way of opening doors that should stay shut. With ridership in freefall and the government breathing down their necks, the railroad was ready to listen to ideas that would have been laughed out of the room just a few years before. James Wright didn't buy the story that American rails were doomed. While consultants tallied up billion-dollar estimates for new tracks, Wright sat in his office at the New York Central Railroad Technical Research Center and scribbled out a different equation. He argued that the real barrier wasn't the rails, it was the weight and drag of the trains themselves. If you could make the cars lighter and push them harder, the old tracks might surprise everyone. His proposal landed on the desk of Alfred Perlman, the railroad's president, in the summer of 1966. Wright didn't ask for a fortune or a government contract. He asked for 30 days and a green light to try something no one else dared. The internal memo spelled out the challenge: prove that a high-speed run was possible on standard track using almost nothing but leftover parts and a wild idea. If it failed, the railroad could shrug and say they tried. If it worked, maybe the whole story about American rails being obsolete would fall apart. The offer was too cheap to ignore and too bold to dismiss. Perlman approved the experiment. The clock started ticking the moment the ink dried. 30 days to find the hardware, build the machine, and put it on the rails. Wright's plan didn't call for a committee or a study. He needed someone who could turn a blueprint into a working beast in a month flat. He needed a pilot who wasn't afraid to ride the thing at full throttle. The search for the right person and the right parts was about to begin. The mood inside the research center flipped from funeral to fever. Suddenly, the question wasn't whether American railroads could survive, it was whether they could pull off the craziest stunt in their history before time ran out. Don Wetzel wasn't the kind of man who waited for permission. He had flown B-25s for the railroad, tinkered with jet engines, and spent his days at the Collingwood Technical Center solving problems most people hadn't even noticed. When the call came for someone to build and drive a jet-powered train in 30 days, Wetzel didn't blink. He signed on, not just to design the beast, but to sit up front and ride the lightning himself. The platform was a Budd RDC-3, a commuter car built for the daily grind, not for speed records. Wetzel picked it because it was light, cheap, and did not need a locomotive to drag it around. Most engineers would have laughed at the idea of pushing a glorified bus past 180 miles per hour. Wetzel saw an advantage. Less weight meant less inertia, and less inertia meant a fighting chance on the battered rails of the Midwest. He wasn't alone. The Collingwood crew worked fast, stripping out seats and swapping in aviation gauges where the train's speedometer topped out. Wetzel's wife, a commercial artist, even sketched the paint scheme, a black nose to cut through the air and a silver body that caught the sun. That is how the car picked up its nickname, the Black Beetle, though Wetzel always preferred its project number, M497. He thought the nickname sounded like something out of a comic book. Wetzel's hands-on approach set the tone. He wanted to feel every vibration, every shudder, every bolt straining against the laws of physics. He had spent years learning how to coax speed out of stubborn machines, and now he was betting his reputation and his neck that a commuter car could do what the experts said was impossible. As the team prepped the car for its transformation, Wetzel was already thinking about what kind of engines could push it into the history books. Don Wetzel didn't waste a second. He needed raw power, not paperwork. The answer wasn't sitting in a catalog, it was rusting in the desert. Out in Tucson, Arizona, the Air Force was clearing out the boneyards. Rows of B-36 Peacemakers, those hulking bombers built to carry nuclear weapons across oceans, were being stripped for parts. Their jet engines, General Electric J4719 turbojets, were relics of Cold War paranoia, designed to push 100 tons of bomber and atomic payload into Soviet airspace. Now they were up for grabs, gathering dust behind a chain-link fence. Wetzel made the call. The price was so low it sounded like a joke. 2 J4719 turbojets, once the pride of Strategic Air Command, sold off for less than the cost of a new Chevy. No government contracts, no bidding wars, just a handshake, a stack of forms, and a promise to haul them east before anyone changed their mind. The paperwork from Tucson listed them as surplus, not scrap, but nobody cared what they were for. As far as the Air Force was concerned, these engines were obsolete junk. For Wetzel, they were the heart of the experiment. Getting them back to Cleveland was another story. Each engine weighed nearly 2 tons. Loading them onto flatbeds, the crew lashed them down with chains and canvas tarps. The drive across the country turned into a rolling joke, truckers on the CB radio asking why anyone would want to buy jet engines from a bomber graveyard. Wetzel didn't bother explaining. He had 30 days to turn a commuter car into a rocket sled, and every hour counted. By the time the engines arrived at Collingwood, the shop floor looked like a madman's science fair. The crew circled the J4719 turbojets, still caked in desert grime, trying to figure out how to bolt bomber power onto a commuter train. Wetzel grinned. He'd spent $5,000 and a weekend on the road, and now he had enough thrust to blow the doors off anything on rails. This wasn't corporate research and development, this was garage science, and it was about to get loud. Wrenches clattered on concrete. The Collingwood shops echoed with the kind of noise that only happens when nobody is following a manual. The Bud RDC sat like a stripped-down muscle car, windows taped, seats ripped out, its insides exposed to the world. The crew did not waste time with blueprints or measurements, just chalk lines, a tape measure, and a gut feeling for what might hold at 180 miles per hour. The jet engines, still streaked with Arizona dust, looked oversized for the roof. Mounting them took more than brute force. The team built custom brackets from scrap steel, bolting them straight through the car's frame. But there was a problem: point those engines straight, and the car would try to lift off the rails like a wing. So they canted the engines downward, just enough to press the wheels harder into the track, tilted down 5 degrees, measured with a carpenter's level, and a prayer. Every bolt, every weld, every bracket was a gamble. There was no time for lab tests. If it rattled loose, they would find out the hard way. Aerodynamics mattered, but nobody was ordering custom fiberglass. The nose cone was hammered together from plywood and sheet metal, painted black to look mean and cut the air. You could still smell the glue. The result was ugly, blunt, and perfect. A shovel nose that looked like it belonged on a dragster, not a train. The rest of the car stayed silver, streaked with fingerprints and grease from a dozen hands. They swapped out the train's speedometer for one ripped from an airplane because the original needle would have snapped off before they even got started. Gauges for fuel, thrust, and temperature were bolted wherever they would fit, wires running like veins across the dash. By the time the last wrench dropped, the Black Beetle sat crouched and angry, ready to do something no one would believe until they saw it. Speed on rails is not just about horsepower or guts. At 180 miles per hour, physics becomes the real enemy. Standard train wheels are not flat. They are tapered like a shallow cone. That taper keeps the car centered on the track at normal speeds, nudging it back in line if it drifts. But push past 100 miles per hour, 120 miles per hour, 150 miles per hour, and that self-correcting motion turns dangerous. The wheels begin to oscillate, searching for center but overshooting each time. Railroaders call it hunting. At low speeds, it is harmless. At jet speed, that side-to-side wobble can grow until the whole train jumps the rails. No warning, no second chance. The track itself was never meant for this kind of punishment. American mainlines in the 1960s were built from short sections of rail, each one bolted to the next. Every joint is a tiny step, a click at 60 miles per hour, a hammer blow at 180 miles per hour. Each impact shakes the frame, rattles the wheels, and sends vibrations racing through the car. The faster you go, the harder the pounding. And then there is the ballast, the bed of gravel under the rails. At these speeds, the jet engines created a pressure wave so fierce it sucked rocks up from the roadbed and hurled them at the car's underbelly like shotgun blasts. The Black Beetle's original speedometer topped out before the real danger began. Wetzel's team had to rip it out and install an aircraft gauge just to keep up with the numbers. Every dial, every bolt, every inch of track was being pushed past its design limit. The only thing between the crew and disaster was a few degrees of downward thrust from the engines, pinning the car to the rails and daring the physics to do their worst. The test site stretched 21 miles across the Ohio flatlands, arrow straight and empty. At dawn, the crew walked the rails, checking every joint and every bolt, eyes scanning for the smallest pebble that could turn into shrapnel at jet speed. The air was thick with anticipation and the faint smell of jet fuel. Don Wetzel climbed into the cab, shoulders tight, hands steady but restless. He glanced at the aircraft speedometer. No turning back now. A chase plane, a Beechcraft Model 18, circled overhead, radio crackling with last-minute checks. The ground team cleared the line. No crowds, no press, just engineers, technicians, and a few railroad brass standing well back. The Black Beetle sat humming at idle, the J-47 engine spooling up with a low whine that grew sharper by the second. The throttle eased forward. The whine became a roar, then a scream. The car shuddered as the jets bit into the morning air, rattling windows in farmhouses miles away. The vibration hammered through the frame, every bolt and weld tested to the edge. Wetzel's jaw clenched against the noise. Inside the cab, it was like sitting inside a drum. Instruments danced, the wheels hammered the joints, each click turning into a machine gun rattle as the speed climbed. The chase plane kept pace, radioing updates. The Beetle shot past mile markers in a blur, sucking up ballast and sending it flying. The sound was not a train whistle, it was pure violence, a wall of wind and engine shriek that drowned out every other thought. The car was no longer rolling, it was flying, daring the track to hold. The speedometer needle kept rising, and so did the tension in every man on board. The sound inside the cab was pure chaos. At full throttle, the J-47 engine screamed so loud that the metal walls vibrated in sympathy, gauges trembling on their mounts. Don Wetzel's hands gripped the controls, eyes flicking between the aircraft speedometer and the blur outside. The chase plane's radio crackled, and someone called a mile marker approaching. The train's steel wheels hammered over every rail joint, each jolt a reminder that this was still 19th century track, never meant for anything close to this. As the Black Beetle tore through Bryan, Ohio, the timing traps blinked. This was the official speed zone. Wetzel watched the needle surge past 180, then 183, then even higher. For a brief moment, the gauge read 196 miles per hour, but he eased off just as they crossed the line. The official record, 183.68 miles per hour. On July 23, 1966, a commuter car loaded with surplus bomber engines and held together by little more than hope and hardware had become the fastest train in American history. The violence of the run faded to silence as Wetzel throttled down. The car coasted, the world outside slowing from a streak to a landscape again. In the cab, the crew let out the breath they had been holding for miles. No cheers, just a stunned, exhausted relief. The numbers did not lie, the timing instruments confirmed it. They had done what the experts said was impossible. For a few precious minutes, the laws of physics and the limits of old American steel had bowed to a handful of engineers and a couple of borrowed jet engines. The record was real, and so was the proof. They had caught lightning in a bottle, and for once, it did not explode in their hands. Nearly 6 decades later, America's fastest train is still a relic, not a blueprint. High-speed rail in the US remains an unrealized promise, trapped by the same risk-averse thinking that sidelined the Black Beetle. If one plywood and jet engine experiment could shatter limits, what's stopping us now? Sometimes, the real barrier isn't technology, it's the courage to use it. Drop your thoughts below and join the conversation.